Tonight's speaker, Dr. Ann Matossian, comes to us from Minneapolis, where she's a board member and past president of the Armenian Cultural Organization of Minnesota, and she's deeply involved in all aspects of the Armenian-American community there. Dr. Matossian also serves as program director of the Kopeschian Family Foundation in Minneapolis, and she has been the East Coast editor of the Armenian Reporter newspaper. She holds a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania. She is a published poet. She's the author of numerous articles on genocide denial and revisionism, among other subjects. On a personal note, I would add that although she keeps a low profile for the most part, she is an indispensable source of information, insight, good counsel, good humor, and she's the epitome of all that is good in the term community leader, and nothing that is bad in that term. From an organizational standpoint, I should mention that she's a NAASR member. Her father was a NAASR Life member, and her mother is the distinguished scholar Mary Kilbourne Matossian, whose books, The Impact of Soviet Politics in Armenia and Armenian Village Life Before 1914, are very important works. Dr. Matossian is in the area this week in order to work with Professor Taner Akjam, copy editing Dr. Akjam's next English language book, the Turkish version of which was published in 2008, and the English will be out in
Nobody knows.
the not too distant future.
Yes.
Followed by a lecture somewhere here?
Oh, yeah,
Yes, okay. A few very brief words about her subject tonight, Dr. Matossian's subject. It was only a few months ago that I first read in translation Bedros Keljik's Armenian-American sketches. As was mentioned in the flyer for this lecture, these sketches are being published in English by Ari Sevag on the new Ararat magazine online, which I have the honor of serving on the editorial board. So I'd never read anything else like these sketches in the Armenian world. They offer slices of very early Armenian-American life in a very vivid way. It's no wonder that Bob Myrak, who is here tonight, invokes them in his great book, Torn Between Two Lands. These sketches are so striking. Allowing for significant differences of style, some of them reminded me of aspects of Joyce's Dubliners stories. Small, telling, incisive, not necessarily pleasant or self-flattering stories that give an insight into a particular time and place. Or maybe they remind me of Chekhov's stories that were also very influential on Joyce's Dubliners. Anyway, they're pretty impressive stories. And I'm delighted that Dr. Matossian has been able to make time in her very busy schedule to be here with us tonight. So please join me in welcoming her to NAASR. Thanks. I want to mention one other thing. It wasn't in my notes, so I didn't mention it, but we have members of the Keljik family here tonight, and I'd like to ask them before the lecture just to please stand, wave, and be acknowledged. Maybe we can hear from you later. Let's see how it goes.
Okay, Mark, I'm thoroughly embarrassed now. That was so nice. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Author, activist, and entrepreneur, Bedros Arakel Keljik, 1874 to 1959. A student of Armenian realist writer Tlgadintzi, belongs to the founding generation of Armenian-American authors. Yet his trenchant sketches of early immigrant life, from Massachusetts to Minnesota, have only recently been rescued from obscurity. Although Minnesota Armenians have always recognized Keljik as the founder of our community in 1899, the very existence of his 1944 collection of short stories, Amerigahai Badgirner, came as a surprise even to his own family. In the mid-1990s, grandson Mark, the third-generation owner of Keljik's Oriental Rugs in Minneapolis, discovered the book quite by accident on a visit to the Library of Congress. We borrowed a copy from the Cleveland Public Library, and in 1997, Ararat Quarterly published my translation of Chicago Characters, the first of Keljik's stories to appear in English. Not long afterwards, I was honored to receive from Bedros' son Woodrow a manila envelope that contained Keljik's correspondence with woman suffrage leader and international humanitarian Alice Stone Blackwell. This unpublished collection provided an intimate look at the Armenian-American literary and political scene of the 1890s, including Blackwell's romance with Ohanes Hachumian and the founding of the influential political group, the Friends of Armenia. The Keljik-Blackwell letters, now in the Library of Congress, became the basis of a second article in Ararat in 1999. With the help of Robert Myrack, and I'd love to know where you are, Robert. We've never met, but I owe you a great debt. Thank you, sir. With the help of Robert Myrack, I was able to confirm that the Bedros Keljik mentioned in his great study, Torn Between Two Lands, the Bedros Keljik of the letters, and the Bedros Keljik of Minnesota were one and the same. Later that year, the story of the Keljik letters found its way into the Armenian Heritage Press anthology, The Armenians of New England, edited by Mark Armenian, and Peter Balakian drew on the same material for his 2003 history of the Armenian genocide and America's response, The Burning Tigris. So, having emerged as a supporting character in these historical narratives, however, the life and especially the work of Bedros Keljik await rediscovery. Although absent from Forgotten Bread, the 2007 anthology of first-generation Armenian-American writers, Keljik's short stories, as Mark has mentioned, have begun to appear in serial form in Ararat, itself recently relaunched as an online journal, as translated by editor Aris Savak. So at this point, I wish also to thank Ruth Tomasian of Project SAVE for collecting and preserving historic photographs from the Twin Cities Keljik and Hnchag clan. One of those photos graces the cover of this year's Project SAVE Oriental Road calendar. Thank you, Ruth. Also, as I know, there are Keljiks here in the Boston area, as well as in Chicago, which only goes to show that the Massachusetts to Minnesota connection remains well and strong more than 100 years later. So, again, thank you all for coming this evening, and now please allow me to introduce you to author, activist, and entrepreneur Bedros Keljik. I will begin with a sketch of his life, and then I hope, if time permits, I'll read from one or two of his stories. They're short. Bedros Arakel Keljik, according to a memoir by his son Woodrow, was born Bedros Arakel Keljik in Kharpert, or Kharpert, Western Armenia, in 1874. The name Keljik, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the name Keljik is an anglicized form of Keljik, the name of a nearby lake. The Armenian name is Zovig or Zovigian, or Zovikian. Sometimes it's called that in English. If you've read Leslie Davis's book, The Slaughterhouse Province, or if you've seen Michael Hagopian's film, Voices from the Lake, you'll remember Lake Keljik as the site of a great massacre during the Armenian genocide. But by that time, Bedros Keljik had made his journey from the Mideast to the Midwest. In his collection of short stories, America Hai Badgirner, Keljik acknowledges the indelible influence of his teacher Tlgadintzi, who saw in Armenian provincial life the dignity of literature. Such writers as Vahan Totovens, Rupen Zartarian, Penyamin Nurigyan, Hamasted, and Vahe Haig were Keljik's fellow students. Those who survived the genocide, Keljik among them, banded together in 1927 to publish what remained of Tlgadintzi's writings. I will show you right here. This is from the NAASR Library. This is the collected writings of Tlgadintzi, Boston, 1927, which I am holding in my hand for the first time. Thank you, Mark. And this, by the way, this is America Hayban Gevnir, Armenian-American sketches. So, Bedros Keljik was also not the only writer in his family. His younger brother, Krikor, who possessed a more romantic temperament, became an American-Armenian novelist and poet of some note in the 1930s and 1940s, as well as a contributor to Hayrenik under the pseudonym K. Devrish. Vahan Totovens, author of Life on the Old Roman Road and other works, was Bedros' nephew on his mother's side, educated at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and employed at the Keljik Oriental rug store until his departure as a gamavur, or volunteer, in the Caucasus Army. Keljik made his own departure from Ottoman Turkey in 1890. His narrative of escape was later published in the Boston Globe and reprinted in the New York Times. So it's accessible now. I think it was published about 1894. And the historical New York Times that you can access online and search by keywords, you can find it there. So, he departed in 1890. For the first 2 years in America, he worked in factories in Worcester and Fitchburg, an experience that would be reflected in his writing. Keljik's fictional character, Magar Aha, returns to his native Kharpert just in time to die, quote, worn out, exhausted by factory life in America, in the translation by Robert Meyer. By 1892, Keljik was holding down a job in an Oriental rug store in Boston while attending the Boston Latin School. The next year, he bought a small retail business, which he called the Ararat, at 351 Columbus Avenue, near Dartmouth Street, where he sold coffee and rolls, fruit, tobacco, and novelties, and observed people from all walks of life. Among them was Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, whose home, when in Boston, was number 569, just up the street. As a lieutenant of Hnchag Party organizer Hnchag Party, Keljik was active in the first permanent political organization to call for Armenian rights and national independence. A fiery orator, at age 19, Keljik called Armenians to arms at public rallies that drew hundreds of immigrants. And this is also reflected in the Hnchag Blackwell letters. At one point she says, "Good luck to the meeting at Worcester," she writes to Keljik. Keljik, I'm a little ahead of myself, Keljik also served as secretary of the Armenian Literary Club of Boston, which is probably how he met Alice Stone Blackwell, a leader of the politically influential group Friends of Armenia. Their mutual friend, Harvard theology student Ohanes Hachumian, had recently opened up to Blackwell what she called a whole new world in Armenian history and literature, and would become the only serious romance of Blackwell's life. In 1894, Hachumian returned to Leipzig to finish his studies, and Blackwell turned to Keljik for help in introducing Armenian literature to an American audience. In Woodrow Keljik's words, Alice took an interest in Bedros on three fronts. First, as an idealistic young man interested in justice, humanity, and patriotism. Second, in connection with the whole Armenian cause. And third, as a source of translating into English Armenian poems, which she then versified. This cultural project turned political as news of the Hamidian massacres reached the American press, and Khachumian's failing health lent it personal urgency. In 1896, shortly before his death from tuberculosis, Blackwell published the groundbreaking anthology, Armenian Poems. Did you just bring in Armenian Poems?
I brought more water for you.
Oh, I thought you brought in Armenian Poems.
In case there's a fire or something.
Blackwell published the groundbreaking anthology, which she called Armenian Poems, in 1896, convinced, as she wrote, quote, that the sympathy already felt for the Armenians in their martyrdom at the hands of the Turks would be deepened by an acquaintance with the temper and genius of the people as shown in their poetry. After this harrowing period, and with the Hnchags in disarray, Bedros Keljik, now 21 and an American citizen, was ready for a change of scene. Encouraged by Blackwell, he hoped to enter the University of Chicago. In the meantime, he sold his business, bought a gramophone, and spent the months before the presidential election traveling up and down the Hudson River, playing the speeches of William Jennings Bryan and his opponent, William McKinley, for paying crowds. Following the 1896 election, Keljik was sent to Chicago, made it to Chicago, as a tobacco salesman for a New York-based company, but was soon hired away by the department store Carson Peary Scott to sell Oriental rugs. And there's a story about how he got hired. He walked in front of the department store in the window where they had the rug, and he walked in and he said, you know, you can get more for that rug because you're not really displaying it right. And what do you mean we're not displaying it right? He says, just turn it over, just turn it around. So they turned it around, and sure enough, the light side of the rug, you know, there's the light side and the dark side of the rug, depending on the angle you view it from. He said, see, it looks way better now, and of course they hired him. That's the family story. On his own, he was also doing a brisk business distributing copies of the anthology Armenian Poems. During the congressional election of 1898, he stumped for the Democratic Party in Cook County, addressing immigrant groups, and somehow found the time to attend night school at Kent College of Law, graduating in May 1899. Bedros Keljik moved to St. Paul that November, becoming the first Armenian to settle permanently in Minnesota, and was soon followed by his brother Kharpert and other relatives, most of whom were involved in the family Oriental rug business. He married Zabel Kirtikian of Constantinople and had 3 children, Woodrow, Emerson, and Suzanne. You know who he admired. According to Woodrow, Blackwell sent Keljik a final letter in 1903, but its whereabouts, unfortunately, are unknown. Minneapolis, St. Paul, at the turn of the century, was a growing market for the Oriental rug trade. Major department stores, and I've seen their ads, advertised their native Armenian experts and could afford to send buyers to New York and Constantinople. Many of the Armenian newcomers to the Twin Cities were first employed as rug repairers, then moved to the sales floor as their English improved. But Bedros Keljik, with his fluent English and American passport, was independent from the start and competed successfully with the department stores as a so-called native direct importer. A major client in the early days, St. Paul Railroad magnate James J. Hill, depended on the Keljik firm to maintain the scores of Oriental rugs in his vast Summit Avenue mansion. And the reason I know that is because James J. Hill, who worked his way up, did not start out wealthy, saved every receipt for everything he ever bought, including all the receipts for the rug repairs and the rug buying and rug cleaning, so we know. By the time of the Armenian genocide, Keljik, the former revolutionary, was well established in St. Paul, and we can assume he was among the community leaders who organized the Twin Cities Armenian mass meeting on May 9, 1915, to petition President Wilson to intervene to prevent massacres which they were afraid would be worse than the massacres of the 1890s, and they were right. Newspapers of the day offered glimpses of Keljik being interviewed about the situation in Ottoman Turkey and conferring with Near East Relief, which had a big office in the Twin Cities. No longer the immigrant firebrand, but an Armenian-American businessman engaged in citizen advocacy. To tell the truth, Bedros Keljik at midlife was becoming a bit cynical. From about 1923, it was as though the devastation of the genocide, the abandonment of the Armenian cause at Lausanne, and the rise and fall of independent Armenia had forced him to reassess the ideals of his revolutionary youth, the romance of the Friends of Armenia, and his own comfort and mortality. To judge from the short stories written at this time, maturity had brought to Bedros Keljik a measure of realism, the literary realism of his first teacher. As I said at the beginning, the origin of Keljik's short story collection, Ameriga Haybatgernir, or Armenian-American Sketches, is something of a mystery. It was published during World War II, while his sons were in the service, his daughter having died young. And since neither Woodrow nor Emerson knew Armenian, they could not have read the book even if they had been aware of it. And I asked them both before they died, and they did not know. In any case, Tlgadintzi and his unpublished manuscripts, as well as the provincial world they described, had perished in 1915, but the lessons he had imparted were strikingly modern. Tell the truth. Write your Armenian story. Say what you know. And so, in his native Western Armenian, Bedros Keljik wrote this: I belong to that group of the old generation, which came to America in scant numbers more than half a century ago. Over these many years, not only did I not forget my mother tongue, which unfortunately turned out to be the case for many, but on the contrary, I developed proficiency therein by waging a struggle against the oppressive, complex, and turbulent life of this country. By keeping up with Armenian literature and the Armenian press during the period in which our vernacular was born and developed, I have derived a great deal of satisfaction, which is totally different from the pleasures I derived from tapping into the wealth of foreign literature. My second satisfaction arose from the fact that by not forgetting my mother tongue, I fulfilled a moral obligation, one which my teacher, the late Tlgadintzi, placed upon me and my friends. Observe our surroundings before looking afar. It was Tlgadintzi, in front of whom we sat in a kneeling position and savored the sweetness of beautiful Armenian literature, as well as the supreme value and depth of our classical language. Tlgadintzi expected us to maintain Armenian literature and to give a realistic depiction of Armenian life even in a foreign environment, no matter where we were. It was up to Bedros Keljik Armenian-American writer, to work out what that might mean. Let me pause here for a few questions, if you have any, and then I would love to share with you the Keljik story I originally translated, Chicago Characters. Thank you. Any questions before I dive into Chicago Characters? Yes?
Would I be correct in assuming that our hero identified and supported William Jennings Bryan in 1896, since he at that point was not yet cynical and probably identified with the oppressed?
Probably.
I didn't know if that had come through in your research, but we'll just guess.
Probably. And to really confirm that, I would go back to Woodrow's biography of his father, which was pretty detailed. Woodrow was a good observer, and I believe his biography was based on many conversations with his father. And in order to reconstruct the life of Bedros Keljik, I've had to, for example, the story of James J. Hill and the Receipts. It was a tradition from Woodrow's biography that James J. Hill had been the first big customer, but I wanted to see if that could be substantiated. Fortunately, there's the James J. Hill Library right there in St. Paul, so, you know, I have never seen anything in Woodrow's work that I haven't substantiated, and I'm sure that that's in there too.
Quite a leap from William Jennings Bryan to James J. Hill.
Well, that was business.
Right.
This was politics. But this was Bedros Keljik, business, politics, and how do you make this work? Another question? Hey, Barbara.
Any more about why he came to America or the circumstances of his time?
Good question. I don't recall right now. I would have to look at that that episode in that article in the Boston Globe, but the article had to do more with sort of the adventure of how he got out of Turkey at a time when it was very risky. I mean, you know, risking your life to do that. I had the feeling that he was in an oppressive situation at home, you know, in his community, but the specifics of that I do not right now recall. I can find out for you though.
How did it come about that the Globe published that? Or did I miss something?
The Globe published it in 1894, I believe, and this was at the height of the Hamidian massacres and the agitation for American support for Armenians. So my guess is that that probably was arranged through the Friends of Armenia, if not Alice Stone Blackwell herself. So he came in 1890, but I think it's very telling that the story of his arrival and how hair-raising that was would appear at a politically strategic time of 1894. That's what I
The
imagine.
Friends of Armenian Culture would have given the idea to the Globe?
It seems likely to me.
Yeah.
It seems likely. Otherwise, why would the Globe be interested in the story of one immigrant 4 years later? You know, you have to ask. So it's plausible to me. Jay?
Yeah, it's a complex question. It's a fascinating lecture. You mentioned that he knew Vahan Totovent.
He was his uncle.
He was his
his
uncle.
kiri, his
So he
maternal
knew
uncle.
him well.
Very well.
And Vahan Totovent became a Hayranadars, right? He went back to
Yes.
Armenia.
Yes, he did.
And then he was killed in 1937 during the Stalin purges.
Correct.
Okay, so we have Keljik's teacher Tlgadintzi, who perishes in 1915.
Right.
Great Armenian writer.
Yes.
And then Totovent, another kind of great Armenian writer, perishing in another mass killing.
And Totovents also, as I understand, was also a student of Tlgadintzi.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
and
yeah.
and he writes about Kharpert
Okay.
extensively, and
Yeah.
then also about people from Western Armenia adapting to conditions under the Soviet regime
Right.
in a very satirical way.
Right.
Did Keljik know about his fate in the USSR? Was he aware of what had happened to him in '37?
He must have.
Uh-huh.
I don't know something specific about that. He must have. Let me think if it's reflected. See, the thing is, Keljik's correspondence, other than his correspondence with Blackwell from a much
Mhm.
earlier period, has not survived.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really good question, and it's another one where I would have to go to the Woodrow biography and see. But it's the kind of thing that I would expect to show up in sort of coded form, possibly in one of the Keljik stories. For example, he doesn't write very directly about the genocide, you know, another hugely traumatic thing, but he kind of edges around it when he's talking about the effect on the local community in Minneapolis-St. Paul, but he fictionalizes it. If there is, you know, I would have to read the story to see if he's dealing with it in a fictional form.
Yeah.
That
Can
I
I
don't know.
just follow
Yes.
with a question? Because when you were talking about how by 1923 he was disillusioned by the abandonment of Armenia.
This is my surmise reading
Yeah,
from the
of
stories.
course,
Yeah.
of course.
Mhm.
Yeah. I then thought, okay, Soviet Armenia, meanwhile, is being rebuilt and advertised as a reborn Armenia.
Right.
Yeah. Then Soviet Armenia is subjected to Stalinist repressions.
Right.
So it's a kind of a second terrible disillusionment, especially for people who are on the Armenian left,
Okay.
like Hnchag.
So are you suggesting then that part of the disillusionment that you see in the stories is really kind of a post-Soviet one?
No, I'm wondering about the chronology, because America Haibad Gerner dates to 1944,
No, wait.
right?
It was published in 1944, but written over the previous, say, 20 years.
20
That's what he
years.
says, yeah.
Uh-huh.
He says.
Okay.
So I'm thinking, this is in my reconstruction, that sometime in the 1920s, he was reassessing, you know, looking back, you know, I mean, the big agitation now was over, it was after 1923, you know, he has the opportunity to look back because they're collecting Tlgadintzi's stories, you know, he's well established, you know, kind of his political career is basically over by this time. What's he gonna do? And it's time to reassess, but that's a really good thread to put that in.
I was thinking of it in juxtaposition to
Yeah.
William Saroyan,
Huh,
because William Saroyan, living in America, looking at people who, from Bitlis, who had survived the genocide,
Right.
hearing stories of those who hadn't,
yeah.
then goes to the Soviet Union in 1935, has mixed impressions,
Mhm.
sees what's happening there,
Mhm.
and then responds to this with "My name is Aram,"
Oh.
and in his later works with more and more sketches of people making their way as individuals and as complicated, traumatized individuals in the American milieu as Armenians. And I'm just wondering about this staggering double trauma response to it. And the response is so striking that this is a businessman, after all, for most of his life, that it's a literary response parallel in some ways to what Saroyan does. He kind of negotiates between the communal and the political and the highly personal, and using this realistic technique.
That's wonderful, thank you so much for that observation.
Yeah, just fascinating stuff.
Once Keljik's stories are published, and again, I encourage anybody who's interested in reading them, you can just go online to Ararat magazine, and they're coming out at the rate of about, I don't know, one every week or two, you know? So by the end of the year, you're gonna be seeing them all. They started being published in June, so it's pretty easy to get them all even now, including that introduction I just read, that's part of it. Yeah, so it's all there. But once all the Keljik stories come out, I hope, really hope, that a literary scholar, hello James, you know, that a literary scholar of Armenian-American literature will start to sort of reintegrate Bedros Keljik into this Armenian-American literary world. That's, you know, not my not-so-secret agenda here. I want to put Keljik back into the discussion because he was very much a part of the discussion from his student days onward. And this book, and I thank Mark Lemigonian for sending this to me. I mean, he is listed among the ex-student, the former students. What do they call this? The Alumni Union of Tlgadintzi, Boston, Mass. is what they call it here. He's listed in there, yeah, as one of the people who helped put this together.
And the book is filled with photographs of Kharpert from the Malikian
Wow.
collection
Wow.
as well.
Wow. And you know, it's an interesting thing too. Actually, I should read Chicago Characters because there is a little, there's a theme that happens throughout these stories, many of the stories. They talk about, you know, somebody's unpublished manuscripts that were never found or lost or something. There's kind of a theme of that, and former revolutionaries and what happened to them, and this sort of thing. So,
Do read it.
I will. Any other questions before I do? Yes.
Can you I know you touched on it in the beginning, but somebody like Tlgadintzi for me is an unknown.
Yeah,
Can you kind of recap
who he
the
was.
motivation that his students might have derived from him?
His students were people from the provinces, from Kharpert province.
Was he teaching at Euphrates College?
I think he was actually teaching at a high school there.
Okay.
I don't know if he also taught at Euphrates College. That I don't know. I don't know that much about Tlgadintzi, to give you the honest truth. What I do know, what I've read about Tlgadintzi, is that at the time, Armenian literature was very focused on Constantinople and life in Constantinople.
Exactly.
This is the thing. And Tlgadintzi was what we might call like a realist and a local colorist. He didn't romanticize the provinces, and he wasn't all that interested in Constantinople. He really believed that Armenian life in the provinces, in its real dimensions, was a subject worthy of literature, that it was a very rich subject, and that Armenian life, wherever Armenians lived, this is what Bedros said, right? Start with what you know, and write that before you start looking elsewhere. Write what you know. Every fiction writer's class, right? Don't they always tell you, write what you know? Tlgadintzi was saying this. In the 90s, no, before that, in the 1880s, when Keljik would have been his student. This was Tlgadintzi's great innovation. If you look at surveys of Armenian literature in English, you will see references to Tlgadintzi really being the one who put that approach on the Armenian literary map. Because before that, the provinces were not really considered worthy of literary treatment. Let's put it that way. That's my understanding, James.
Well, in the West,
Yes.
because in Eastern Armenia,
Okay.
there was already for several decades
Okay.
before that a literature which treated provincial questions and even explored provincial dialects.
Really.
They were influenced by the Russian Narodniki of
Okay.
the 1860s.
Okay.
The idea was going to the people,
Mm.
and Yervan Dodyan's parodies, Unger Panchuni,
Yeah.
was all about basically city kids who thought they knew everything, marching out to tell peasants how to be Armenian.
I love this. Well, there are
Yeah.
characters like that in Keljik stories.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we have a hint of what Tlgadintzi might have been reading.
Oh yeah, because there was some back and forth. It's like Mikhail Nalbandian even
Yeah.
went to Constantinople, so.
Nalbandian shows up in the Hnchag Blackwell correspondence, and he was one of the poets in Armenian poetry, in the
there.
anthology Armenian Poems. So okay, now we're starting to put this back together. All right. So Chicago characters, and it's not real long. Okay. Don't worry. By the way, the original title of the story was The Armenian Colony of Chicago in 1895. But I took a little literary license, so to me it's Chicago characters. In 1895, no other city in the world embraced such human variety as Chicago, where I was a student. From the lowest sort of man to the loftiest idealist, it seemed that everyone with enough drive and an eye for opportunity, with enough wit, as the saying goes, to sell his mother's knitting, had gathered there from the four corners of the earth. To this jumbled and riotous multitude, the Armenian colony had contributed its share of no more than 300 souls, immigrants from every region, humble laborers, as well as nearly a dozen students, whose character and conduct lent the city their own measure of interest. Huilutsi Elo, who ran the colony's restaurant, liked to be called Tlgadintzi Elo, after the well-known writer, because of his revolutionary ideals. He was a short, stocky man with eyes, head, and mouth as round as his rotund body. All the unemployed Armenians, without distinction or explanation, ate at Elo's, and some of them even slept there every night. There was no obligation, only the promise of future payment, and eventually Elo went out of business. So much for Elo. Kenene Gisomo, who played Turkish tunes on his violin, used to eat there for free. There was Garo the mule, well known to everyone, and Zakar Keo, who had a bulgur factory. Now, when I say that Zakar Keo had a bulgur factory, the reader need not imagine an imposing building filled with heavy machinery. This so-called factory, really no more than a tumble-down clapboard house, stood at the far edge of town and contained one large kettle. The overseer, an old black man, cooked the wheat in the kettle, then parched it in the courtyard out back. Zakar Keo, who had been a horse trader in his hometown, put all his practiced shrewdness to good use in the bulgur business. One of his clever tricks was to comb through the daily papers for any news of fire at a grain elevator, then hitch up his lame horse to his antiquated wagon and set off with the overseer for the scene of the blaze. Buying up the scorched and blackened wheat for 3 or 4 cents a bushel, Zakar Keo kept his factory well supplied and maintained his reputation as the cheapest bulgur seller in America. He shipped most of it to Boston, Worcester, and the other sizable Armenian colonies of the day. Soon enough, letters would begin to arrive from Boston, Worcester, Lynn, Lowell, and everywhere else, complaining that the bulgur tasted of smoke and ashes, that it was in fact inedible. Could not eat it. Naturally, Zakar Keo had anticipated this response ever since the bulgur was first loaded onto the train and had prepared a form letter to answer the complaints. He put a half-starved Armenian to work making copies, which were thus ready to mail at any time, and were even praised in Armenian kitchens all over the country. This is what he wrote. Dear fellow Armenian, thank you for your letter. Our factory is furnished with the latest equipment, conforms to all sanitation codes, and is certified by the authorities as one of the cleanest factories in Chicago. For our esteemed customers, we purchase #1 Minnesota wheat, the world's choicest variety for taste and nutrition. I am surprised that you mention smoke and ash. Such an incident might occur 1,000 miles from here and be caused by smoke from the train's locomotive. Consequently, the responsibility rests with the railroad company. I suggest that you hire a clever lawyer and double your damage claim against the railroad. With best wishes, yours in the love of the homeland, Zakar Keo, owner and operator of the largest bulgur factory in Chicago. That's Zakar Keo. Another group of Armenians lived in one house on the old common system, where each paid his share of the rent, with their leader, One-Eyed Nigobos. Due to some ingenious and possibly shady dealings of their own, every one of these men had money in the bank and an affected air of gentility. So the place where they were living thus became known as the uncommon house. But the colony's most curious character was Garo the mule, whose appearance can be sketched in just a few words. His face was longer than it was wide, as if the midwife had mistakenly squeezed his head from the side, and this head consisted of a large, heavy skull from which 2 fleshy ears hung like a pair of tombstones. Add a rebellious black mustache, which always seemed to be pointing north, and there you have the face of Garo the mule. The following parts of his body also had a mule-like character: a wide chest, dull, heavy eyes, and a thick, stubborn neck that seldom moved. Now, I don't know if Garo was as strong as a mule, but he was slow enough to pass for one. With no appetite for work, perpetually unemployed and broke, he usually slept in Ello's restaurant on a couple of broken chairs. To his face, no one dared call this comrade Garo the Mule, although for a joke, some people referred to him as the Terrible Turk. In his presence, the usual name, of which he was rather proud, was Garo the Champ. According to his wildly exaggerated accounts, back home in Constantinople, he had felled with one blow any number of world-renowned fighters, Greeks, Kurds, Circassians, and even Turks. Nor were his tall tales limited to his athletic prowess. He also claimed to have been a licensing broker for the Berlin-Baghdad Railway and expected a payment of 60,000 pounds in gold the next time the Kaiser visited Turkey. By his own description, Garo had once led the life of a revolutionary, the companion of daring men like Giray and Gem Almaz Manuk. He had been imprisoned as a suspected subversive. Then one evening, about a month after his arrest, while the jailer sat smoking a nargile or water pipe in his nightshirt and green slippers, his friend Habzi Pasha sent word that Garabed Efendi was to be released. But by that time, Garo himself had already escaped. Kemeneci Solomon, sarcastic sort of fellow, once asked Garo the Mule, if there were a nightshirt, green slippers, and a nargile back in prison, why are you sleeping on a couple of chairs at Elo's place? Why don't you go back to Constantinople and get arrested again? I have a mission to accomplish here, replied Garo the Mule, explaining that in his days as a revolutionary, he had a passing acquaintance with the great Armenians of the time, had been RPR's inseparable companion, the pair of them as close as two halves of a walnut shell, and was lieutenant to Archbishop Narbe of sacred memory, entrusted with many important and confidential messages. When the soul of the great Narbe passed away, his head was cradled in Garo's arms, and only Garo knew where Narbe's key writings and unpublished manuscripts were buried. If I could only get my hands on a spare $300, I'd go straight to Constantinople and bring out those writings as a service to the Armenian nation. But I need to earn the money first. That's the reason I stay here, he said. There was a young man known as Davulji Dono's son from the town of Kharpert, who made his living from an Oriental dance troupe that he sent on tour to perform in various cities. One time, when Garo the Mule came up to him and started bragging about his days as a champion, claiming that he could get beneath any horse and lift it bodily into the air, Davulji Dono's son's mouth watered at this newfound opportunity to make money. Wanting to be convinced of Garo's prodigious strength, he proposed that they go to the nearest stable for a demonstration. Now, Garo the Mule was not so dumb as all that, and contrary to his name, occasionally showed a bit of horse sense. Fine, he said, accepting the challenge, but added, you know, for the last 3 days I've been living on nothing but a handful of beans. I'm at the end of my strength. In my condition, I could barely pick up the leg of a goat. Thus, at Dono's son's expense, Garo got a trip to the bathhouse, a good shave, and a respectable meal. Afterwards, the two of them met on Milwaukee Avenue and headed over to Keller's stable, where the fabled ritual was to take place. Of course, Garo the Mule was unable to budge a single horse. The stable, it turned out, had no Arabians, and without a drop of that racing blood, the American breed just didn't move fast enough. What can you do? With my friend, another young student, I would occasionally visit the Armenian coffee house on Milwaukee Avenue, where we always found Garo the Mule. Late in the evening, when we were about to go home across the Chicago River Bridge, Garo would rise to his feet, exclaiming, "Tlgadintzi, shame on me if I let you inexperienced boys walk those dangerous streets alone. I'll come with you as far as the bridge. After that, you'll get home safely." He would walk with us down the dark streets until we reached the bridge. And just where you could see the tavern on the other side, he stopped and said goodnight. Again, Selamet, he would say, "May you arrive safely." As we crossed over, he would be gazing at the tavern with longing eyes and a thirsty expression. "Good night," his voice came once more, while in the tavern, under the light of innumerable lamps, beer glasses stood glittering on the shelves in row after soldierly row. My student friend would say, "Don't you get it? The man needs a drink." So we would buy him one, and with a final, "Take care, boys," Garo the mule was on his way, satisfied not only in our safe arrival, but also in the hope of a small glassful now and then. One day, the news came that the champ had been found dead on the chairs in Ello's restaurant. He never accomplished his mission, and Narbe's unpublished manuscripts remain buried to this day.
Now, I have more questions, and I suspect probably other people do too. But I wanted to mention that Luann mentioned Keljik's brother, who wrote under the name of Devrish. And if you look in the back display case there on the right-hand side, there's a book and a piece of artwork next to the book. The book is by Devrish, and the artwork is the original artwork for the book. The daughter of Devrish was a longtime member of NAASR, Zarm Keljik Geisenhoff from Minneapolis. And after her father died, she gave some of his books and things to us, which are in our library, including that piece of artwork, and including a number of 78 RPM records of her father reading his poems. Very interesting.
And can I just say, thank you for mentioning that, on the cover of that book, and that's an engraving by Minneapolis photo engraver Diran Minas. You'll see, I don't know how much you can see, but there is a figure of a man standing up. He's a wanderer of some kind. He's the dervish, the wandering dervish. Devrish is a variation of dervish, okay? And the book is Krikor's romantic national novel called Devrishin Keshkira, or the Dervish's Begging Bowl, or something like that. And there he is with his begging bowl on his belt. And in the back, if I'm not mistaken, Diran Minassian has drawn a picture of Lake Keljik, and in a reference to the author's origins. And in the middle of the lake, there's an island and there used to be a monastery or something on that island. That's what he built into that. So thank you, Mark.
And these stories, which again you'll have the chance to read online as they appear, are the one that Luann read is very, I'd say, is very representative. There's nothing sentimental about these stories. These aren't, gosh darn it, we Armenian-Americans are a great bunch and we sure take care of each other and isn't this wonderful, and they're really very funny and satirical and cutting in their way. And it's interesting because the question I was going to ask is, as far as I remember, all the stories seem to describe pre-1915 Armenian-American life. Is that fair to say?
Most of them, not all of them. There are one or two post-genocide stories where the community's kind of trying to deal, but mostly he sticks to the pre-genocide period, yeah.
And did any of the stories appear Did any of the stories appear
Sorry, come up.
in any form?
I'm sorry, should I
before?
repeat what I just said? Did anybody need to hear that? The answer to what period of time did the stories deal with, most of them are kind of the 1890s up to, you know, the pre-genocide period. There are a couple of stories. There's one called Belashkaro, where Belashkaro was a peasant who had survived the deportations and was quite traumatized by them. And he is a character in one of the stories. But and there's another one where, I don't remember the title of it, but the community is kind of dealing with the great disappointment of the Treaty of Lausanne and the loss of everything, and what do we do now? But mostly he stuck to the period before the genocide. I don't know how much he was able to sort of process, assimilate, and turn that experience into art at that early date. I don't know if you could do it. So, what was the other question?
Did any of them appear in any form before they appeared in the book?
That would be a really good question for Alice Stone Blackwell. Somebody who knows the Armenian language periodical press, and that's not going to be me. But I do know, and because of the Blackwell Keljik correspondence, that Keljik was sending articles, writing articles for the for the Armenian language press, the international Armenian language press. I would not be the least bit surprised to see something by Keljik, say, in the press of Tbilisi. I don't know about the stories. I would love to know that, and I don't know that. Maybe the archives of, I don't know, Haydn Baikar or one of the others would have it. That's a great question for further research. Since I mentioned the press of Tbilisi and Blackwell, though, I want to add this. In the Keljik-Blackwell letters, sometime in 1894, 5, 6, that period, Blackwell writes to Keljik acknowledging that he had requested from her an article about the women's suffrage movement and the women's movement in general. And it was his aim to translate that article. And she wrote him a 16-page insider's report on the state of American feminism and its differences from Russian feminism also. She wrote this whole long thing, and in her letter, she acknowledges that he was going to translate this and send it to Tiflis. And she said, I was so interested to hear from you that the papers in Tiflis have been discussing, the Armenian papers in Tiflis have been discussing women's rights and women's suffrage. Well, here's your article. Unfortunately, we don't have his answer to that back, but we do know this, that he was just like a month shy of becoming a citizen, so he couldn't vote in the election of 1896. But he writes to Alice Stone Blackwell, I was looking for the suffrage vote. Doesn't look like you got it this time, but I know the time is on your side. He knew that. So, it's quite possible that he was sending the stories out, or that he was, or that even way before he was writing the stories, as early as the 1890s, he could very well have been published in the international press. But as far as the specific stories, I don't know. I just even think it's very strange that his sons didn't even know about them. So I don't know. Did he read them to his wife, Isabel? No idea. That remains for further research. So.
Yes, Beth.
Your reaction is that he certainly is far removed from idealizing his compatriots.
Sure is.
But strangely to me, the Bullitt story tells me that he's far from idealizing the businessman that he became.
Mm-hmm.
It's an absolute cynicism.
He's far from idealizing anything.
He doesn't
That's
idealize
exactly
anything.
the point. That's why I wanted to broaden that beyond.
Thank you.
And he's certainly
Thank
not
you for that
the
point.
streets of America are paved with gold guy either.
I mean, there are moments of great sweetness in his stories. He's not cruel. He's not a cruel writer at all.
If anything, he has tremendous insight into himself, which is
Mm-hmm.
certainly a rarity for most of us.
Yeah, yeah. I just encourage you to, get to know Bedros Keljik as Ira brings it out. That's all I can say.
I thought it was clear to me, anyway, from the snippets you read to us,
Yeah.
that he had tremendous affection
Mm-hmm.
for all these people, and that he obviously was a man who loved people and loved humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Very, so while he may not have been idealistic, and I just thought his love for these people just came through.
Well,
I
this,
agree with that.
would other people agree with that?
Warts and all.
Does that seem, but doesn't that seem consistent though with the approach of Tlgadintzi, right? I mean, why would Tlgadintzi bother to write in a realistic, true way, right, about people in the provinces that maybe the literary elite of Constantinople probably looked down on? I mean, there was a reason why Tlgadintzi would have devoted himself to doing that, and the same thing with Bedros
Well, he
Keljik.
was a populist like William Jennings Bryan.
There you go, thank you.
Yeah, I think also that a lot of the immigrant literature in America fits this pattern.
Really?
Yeah, just from my own experience, there was a Yiddish newspaper in New York called the Vorwärts, which had a section called Bintel Brief, the letters section to the editor.
Yeah.
Abraham Cahan used to write about thieving landlords and defective goods. I mean, in Chicago, you've got The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, all about the meat industry, which is a lot like the Bulgar industry.
We'll never eat Bulgar in the same way.
Yeah, I mean,
Look out for that Chicago Bulgar.
But and there was, I think I agree. It's a sort of a cynicism mixed with affection.
Yeah.
When my grandmother came over from Poland, she used to read this letter section, and she and her kids sisterly fake a letter about their sufferings and difficulties and so on to Cahan, to the Vorwärts, and it was published. And the editor wrote, "I have never read such a candid story of immigrant woe." And the whole thing was made up. So, I mean, I think that a lot of immigrant writing was like this. So,
Yeah.
but these are masterpieces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other comments, questions, or points? I'm learning from you all too. This is like, really.
Well, I'll just say that
Me-
Ben Franklin made up his autobiography.
Well, Bedros Keljik didn't write his
I think
biography,
James
so-
is relative. You're more American than you might have realized.
That's good.
So in that vein, what's the likelihood of the Boston Globe article being made up?
Anybody know anyone who writes for the Boston Globe?
Yeah.
Yeah, if Steve were here, he
That's
would
somebody?
speak up for the Globe, but, no, I believe everything I read in the Globe.
Let the Globe, rediscover him. And also, since Dr. Duranian is here, I should mention that this article in, Robert Myrack speaks of Bedros Keljik calling the immigrants to arms, right, in his passionate speeches at the age of 19 as a Hnchag activist. But the account of that from Myrack's book is taken from the Worcester Telegram. I believe it's from 1893 or 4, something like this. So, I'm sure that in the press of the day, right around here, in your own public library archives, in the microfilm, if you look in the 1890s, you probably will find more sorts of news accounts, and maybe even in the Globe. Did Keljik write letters to the editor? He was certainly capable of it. I don't know. I mean, it's all out here, and this is kind of home ground here and the Twin Cities to find out more. We can put this together.
Was he Hnchag all the way to the end, leftist and?
He was always a liberal, but I think he probably made the jump from Hnchag revolutionary to Democratic Party liberal. And what I know of the family kind of would support that. I mean, they're uniformly a liberal Democratic bunch, and I'm quite sure that they got that from Bedros. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
A small token of our organizational esteem. There are refreshments, the bookstore is open.